Okay, welcome to this lecture. It's part of the CEPR's STEG program, which stands for Structural Transformation and Economic Growth. We want to thank the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office for funding this as part of the UK aid effort. This is the 5th lecture in the class. The previous lectures, both the slides and the recordings are available on YouTube. Both the slides and the recordings are available on our website. Today, we're very happy to have Rachel and Ngai from LSE, who will be talking about home production, labor markets, and structural transformation. Those of you who have been here before know the system. If you're a panelist, if you're in the front row of the class, you can unmute to ask questions. Rachel has requested clarification questions, only clarification questions during the talk, and then we'll have time for a broader discussion in the last 15-20 minutes at the end. Doug Gollin and I will be in the Q&A for those who are just watching as a webinar. And we'll try to answer your questions as best we can. Of course, Rachel's more of an expert on the topic than we are. Let me think. Those in the front row, if you're not asking a question, please mute your mic. And I think that I covered everything, except on Thursday. So this is the 2nd lecture in a module on structural transformation. Last week, Bertolt Herrendorf gave an overview of models. But this is segueing into labor markets. And so next week, Thursday, Mark Rosenzweig from Yale will be giving a supplemental lecture. He's more of a micro development economist, but talking about some of the micro frictions in labor markets in developing countries. With that, let me hand it over to Rachel. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks a lot for Joe and Doug to start this STEP program. I'm sure it's going to be very useful for many people and many countries, and especially this series of courses, I think will be very useful for graduate student in economics. So today I'm going to be talking about structural transformation, home production, and labor market. So as Joe already pointed out, last week, you had the lecture by Bertolt on structural transformation. So, and that is the theme of this program as well. So structural transformation, as you know, is about the changing structure in the economy in terms of both the output and employment share. So typically, as you've seen last week, that we saw the size of the agriculture sector is falling, both in terms of employment share and the value added share. And then we typically see a bell shape or hump shape in manufacturing, and services is rising. So that pattern is very robust when you look across many countries and also look through the whole time series of the historical statistic for many developed countries as well. So today, what we are going to focus on is another very important production sector, and that is the home production sector. And the home production's output is excluded from the GDP, and the input is excluded from employment. But it's a very important sector, as I will show in showing you some of the measurement. So what we are going to focus on today is what is home production, how is it measured, and why is it important, and how is it related to structural transformation. There are many, many relationships, but today, because of the time, I will focus on the implication for labor market. I will take 2 applications. One is the implication for the aggregate labor market, and the other one is the implication for the labor market outcome by gender. Now, I won't be going through the detail of the model or proofs. Once you learn the technique of how to solve this kind of structural transformation model from last week's lecture, many of these models can be solved in a very similar way. So I will not go through the proof. And also you should refer to the papers to see the complete literature because I couldn't put all of them in the slides. Okay, so what is home production? This is a book written by economist Margaret Reed. The book is really about the economics of household production. what she defined as home production, if you look at this quote, there's few elements. First of all, is the time spent at home that you're producing services and goods for the member of the household. Okay? And these output, okay, this time could potentially be marketized. It can be done by a paid worker. So someone else could have produced these goods for you and you just enjoy the output. Okay, so for example, you can think of cleaning, okay? Instead of doing my own cleaning, I could have hired a cleaning lady who cleaned the house for me and I enjoy a clean house. So one key thing about home production and to make it different than leisure is that we enjoy the product of home production, not the time spent on it, okay? Whereas leisure is something different. Leisure is the time we spend on it that we enjoy. So in other words, I will not hire someone to watch TV for me because that will not give me the utility of the leisure. I have to watch the TV myself. Whereas when it comes to home production, I can hire someone to do the input for me and I will enjoy the output. Okay, so this is the broad idea of home production. Now, of course, home production is a concept that has been used quite extensively, both in micro and macro. There's some survey about the study that has been done. So today we will focus mainly in the dimension of structural transformation and labor market. So how do we measure home production? Okay, so when we think about intuitively, it's basically the time I spend on it, okay? So you will turn naturally to some way of measuring how people spend their time. So the first kind of well-known time use survey is the dissertation by Leeds in 1917, where they recorded the time use for 60 families in Pennsylvania. Between 1917 until the first national time use survey available in the United States, there are various time use surveys. They used to have a Bureau of Home Economics, which is kind of like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but that bureau used to basically have time use study. They have stations in different places where they collect, the time budget of the housewife. Because back then, not many women participate in the labor market. So there's a great interest to know what they are doing if they are not participating in the labor market. So it's also some way later on for people to think about the extended national account, because these are resources that's put into production, but doesn't record it in the GDP accounting, the national accounting. So the first national survey started in 1965, and then you have a several wave of time use survey. And then by about 2003, you have this American time use survey. In the beginning, it was every 2 years, then become every year. Then it changed again after the Great Recession when the budget is a bit limited. So there's some academic paper discussing this time use survey. The two good examples is Adrian Hirst and Rainey and Francis. Now, of course, there's also time use for many other countries. If you want to do comparison across country, the two well-known ones are the harmonized European time use survey, which cover mainly the European country. And then you have the multinational time use survey, which cover a broader set of countries. And of course, there are many time use survey at the national level in many countries. So if you look at the publication of the ILO, by the way, I have all these references at the end of the lecture slide, so you can refer to them when you get a copy of the lecture slide online. So ILO has a recent book that basically summarizes all these home production activity and has a summary of 64 national time use survey. And there is also effort in African country to have more time use survey because the gender gap in the time use is included in the African Gender and Development Index. Okay, so you can refer to this paper for that. Just to give you a sense of what it is like about what people do in home production. So in your own personal experience, you might realize your home production as a student very often may be including fixing a lunch for yourself, cleaning your flat, so it would be like cooking and cleaning mainly. And indeed, these are the major activity, even for housewife, for the last about 100 years in the US. you see that the cooking and cleaning is quite a big chunk of the time used. And also when you look at the developing countries, such as here you have Ghana and South Africa example, you see that cooking is quite a big number, okay? And that number is quite similar to the time when the US in the 1920s. And of course, you can think of many reasons why cooking time has decreased over time. It could be because now in America, people will go and buy more fast food. Okay, there are more cheaper fast food around for them to outsource their home production time. It could also be there are innovations that make cooking easier, such as the oven, all the household durables. Okay, all this could be the reason. So when you look at how time use at home has changed, there is really like as if there's a structural transformation happening at home. That family, American family, for example, is spending less time on cooking and cleaning, but more time on caring and household management. So household management will be like doing some accounting of your household budget, or shopping and things like that. So these are in terms of household management. So there is a reallocation away from some of the things that now people usually buy from outside into more doing the things that they do not outsource as much. And there could be also other reasons that the total amount of this home good might be changing over time as well. So in the past, maybe people do not have put as much attention to cleanliness, okay? And they might, now care more about cleanliness because of the germ theory that show that it's important to have a clean home. So even with the washing machine being discovered, we do not see the cleaning time or laundry time reducing by too much. We still spend time doing the laundry because maybe we're doing it more often. We're cleaning the house more often. Okay, so those are all the factors that is behind this possible time pattern. But there is this general pattern. And in the developing country, there are other items that are important. For example, they do spend a lot of time in which part of the cooking is like collecting water and wood, for example. So these are some components specifically in the developing country. There have been some attempt to include the value of home production to create an extended GDP, because the purpose for us to measure GDP really is to understand the economic activity in the country, and also to have a sense of welfare, how many goods and services is out there. So home production, as you can see, is quite a big chunk of time. It's like 50 hours per week is more than a full-time job. So if we included the employment, the market employment in the GDP, then this 50 hour could potentially be producing quite a lot of goods and services comparable to the GDP number. So this is why there are efforts trying to extend the national account and to see how we can measure the value of home production. In general, there are two ways you can do it. You can think of the output evaluation, so meaning that I compare what's the value of cooking. I can look at, if I have to buy this plate of spaghetti, this spaghetti bolognese, if I go to restaurant, how much will I pay? And now at home, I produce it. So you can use that as a value. You can also use an input valuation approach, which is basically to put the value on the input, such as the time you use will be based on the wages, and then the household durable will be like the return to household durable. So this is precisely the method used by Ben Bridgman in his finding for the United States. So he tried to compute the extended GDP for the United States by including the home production. And he found the number to be very substantial. So if you include the GDP from the home production, then the extended GDP is 42% higher than the measured GDP. So it's quite a big number. And this number declined over time, mainly because we see that home production time do decline in the United States. Still, it's quite a big number in 2010, it's still 27%. So this, I hope to convince you, home production is an important production sector, both in terms of the time spent there, and in terms of the potential value that it produces. Okay, and this is why we wanted to spend some time thinking about it. And then when you look at how home production changed, and we've seen from that time use table, we did think there's a lot of reallocation. So Margaret Reed writes in 1934 and talk about how there's a transformation within home. She emphasized that one form of production after another have in part transferred to commercial production. Okay, and then even in 1930, she already observed childcare, education, and care of the sick, and are now to a large extent carried by paid worker. So back then, in 19th century, education is usually, done at home, and the school is really a very recent phenomenon. So that's one of the examples. So, and then 1973, Vanyard has this dissertation. So her supervisor is the pioneer who started the time use survey, the National Time Use Survey in the United States. So she really looked into the first wave of the National Time Use Survey. And then she also documented the same kind of reallocation of tasks within the home production. Again, as we've seen from the table before, the household management part is getting bigger and bigger in terms of the time spent there. Levergott look at this at a more clear angle, basically by looking at consumption expenditure. So what he documents is, look, a lot of these home production, which is cooking and cleaning, now is reflected in consumption expenditure. The household are buying some of these products. So his view is a lot of the housewife has switched from being a producer to a consumer, because he directly looked at the consumption expenditure and to document that a lot of these has been, so-called what we say marketized. So this kind of process of marketization of home production, meaning that over time, you spend less and less time doing this home production yourself. Instead, you're paying someone else to do it. It will show up in the expenditure, consumption expenditure. It will also show up as the employment structure of the economy. We will see sector that produce substitute to the home production expanding. And these sectors very often are the service sectors. Okay, so some recent work by Freeman and Shakir really, push this thought of marketization strongly by using some cross-country time use data to highlight, when you compare differences in hours of work across country, is not the differences in the total hour, but it's the differences in how many of these total hours are at home and how many of these hours are in the market. Okay, so there is quite an interesting line of study there. So let me now turn to my first application, which is look at the interaction between structural transformation, home production for the aggregate labor market. So this application focuses on one important variable, which is hours of work. So for many years, growth and business cycle model in macro, very often they talk about this concept of balance. The balanced growth path is referring to the scenario that the aggregate variable grow at some constant rate. Now, constant rate include zero. So in that kind of balanced growth path, very often they will focus on the model's prediction that hours of work is constant. Okay, so they will have a constant hour work and constant hour in leisure. Okay, so that is a typical kind of model for macro. You can find it in the very classical book on business cycle by Cooley and Prescott. And for that, King, Prosser, and Ribello had developed this balanced growth preferences. So this balanced growth preferences basically will imply in equilibrium, hours of work will be constant. But recently, we see more work looking at the data that shows that market hours per capita are not constant. Okay? Ramey and Francis has the work looking at the US historical data for the 20th century and find that hours of work first fall and then mildly increase later on. There's also a lot of cross-country evidence about hours of work being not constant. So Rogerson talked about how in some countries, the decline never come back, and in some other countries, such as US, hours decline and then come back later on. So the recent work by Big, Funschender, and Lagagos, they have a biggest sample size of country, look into more country at different development stage. And you see similar picture there. There's a big fall in hours work during the early development stage. And at later development stage, some of the country has increasing and some do not increase. So with this changing market hours per capita, that sort of put a challenge to the macro model that used the traditional balanced growth preferences where hours of work stay constant. So a recent paper in the JBE by Bopat and Crusell, they basically propose a generalized balanced growth preferences, basically generalize the Kane-Prosser-Ribello occurrences, and with that preferences, they can obtain a changing hours of work along the balanced growth path. Okay, so then you could have the aggregate balanced growth consistent with hours changing. And that is quite an important feature, especially when you look at the US data, because we see that the US growth has been pretty much at 2% since 1870, but the US hours of work were not constant. So that is one approach to it. Today, I'm going to focus on a second approach, which is to think of how I can get a balanced growth path and changing market hour by thinking carefully, what is non-market hour? Okay, so in this line of research, they very often think of hours work as market hour and hours you don't work is just non-market hour. They do not differentiate what are inside the non-market hour. As we've seen earlier on in the time use study I show you, inside that non-market hour, maybe half of it is home production and the other half is leisure. And in the data, leisure and market hour, home hour has a very different trend. So today my focus is to look at if I explicitly account for the non-market hour has both home hour and leisure hour, how can I use the story of structural transformation to generate a trend in market hour along the balanced growth path? Okay, so that would be my first application. So here's a picture from Francis and Ramy, and this picture is quite typical for many countries, that during the early development stage, the average hours of work in the market is falling, and in the United States, it come up toward the second half after the 1980s. The model will be very similar to the model that you have studied last week under structural transformation, with a key important new component, which is the home production. I'm going to base the lecture on this paper, but I'm going to use a simplified version. So I would say that it's only home production for services. So you will have utility, consumer, demand different kind of final good. There are three types of final goods. There could be agriculture, manufacturing, or services. But services can be produced either in the market or at home. Now, the leisure is 1 minus L, okay? Where L is the total hours of work. So L includes both homework and market work. So this is one of the crucial difference compared to the standard macro literature, where 1 minus L is simply treated as non-market work, and it's just the same thing. Here, we are going to break down this L into home hours and into the market hour, okay? We are going to look at them separately. So how does the interaction happen and what is the important components of it? One important thing, as we've seen from many of these historical studies and also from our own experience, is that many of these home production could potentially be outsourced. In other words, it means that the market and home service are good substitute, okay? They're not perfect substitute, okay? The bolognese I make might taste different from the one that I buy from an Italian restaurant, but they are good enough as a substitute. They're not perfect, but they are good enough. Meaning that if the price in the restaurant drop, it might induce me to buy more from the restaurant. Okay, so that is the good substitute assumption on the elasticity substitution between home and market services. So that sigma is bigger than 1. Epsilon, though, is the substitution across different type of goods, across agriculture, manufacturing, and services. So as you have learned from the last week lecture, most study will claim that that substitution is quite substantially below 1. Okay, so they are not as a good substitute, meaning that as we become richer, as I consume more food and have nicer clothes, I also want better services. Okay, I want better car and better healthcare services, so it's better food. Okay, these things, they are not very good substitute. Okay, and then there will be a production function, just to close the model. The production function will be identical across sector, except this productivity parameter. Okay, so to highlight this mechanism through the changes in productivity that is being different across sector. So gamma J will be the productivity growth, and there will be 4 sectors in this economy: the agriculture sector, the manufacturing sector, the market service, and the home service. Okay, so these will be the 4 sectors. So you can go ahead and solve this model in 3 stages. Okay, think about first, individual has to allocate time between home and market. And in that allocation decision, it basically will have this implication about how individual will marketize their home production. Once you figure out within the good how you are going to allocate between home and market, then you look across different goods. How are you going to allocate time across agriculture, manufacturing, and services? And that step 2 is exactly what you did last week in terms of the structural transformation across the different sectors. Finally, once you have solved all these static allocation, you turn to the dynamic allocation and saying that now for the whole economy, how do I derive the balanced growth path? By allocating capital over time, okay? By deciding consumption and saving decisions, so that give you the capital accumulation. So the mathematics is very straightforward. The static allocation is about equating marginal rate of substitution to marginal rate of technical substitution. And when you look at the dynamic, you basically try to use step 1 and 2 to transform the model into a 1-sector model. And then that go back to your Ramsey growth model. And then you can derive the balanced growth. Okay, so skipping the math, basically this is from the marginal rate of substitution equal to the marginal rate of technical substitution. You derive a very intuitive formula, meaning that the share of labor that is allocated to the market for the services compared to the share of labor allocating to home services, that difference will depend on the differences in the productivity growth and how good substitute they are. Intuitively, all it's saying is that if these are good substitute, my home cooked food and the market bought food, they are good substitute with a sigma bigger than 1, then naturally, when the market sector has a faster productivity growth than the home sector, we will outsource the home production. I will buy more from the market instead of producing at home. So this is what we call the marketization, okay? Due to the fact that the market service sector has faster productivity growth than the home service sector. Then you can go to your step 2, which is to look at how do I allocate time across sector, and that's the structural transformation. Using very similar mathematics, you can derive the labor share into 2 different kinds of goods. It has a similar formula as that formula over there. It's essentially saying the same thing. If the elasticity of substitution is less than 1, then I will reallocate to the sector that has a slower productivity growth. Intuitively, if the car industry is having very fast productivity growth, compared to the health industry. I want good car, I also want good health. How can I achieve both? I will have to reallocate labor away from the car making industry into the healthcare industry, because that's the only way for me to get more healthcare services. Okay, so in this case, you're reallocating resources from the fast growing productivity sector to the slower growing productivity sector because epsilon is less than 1. Now, of course, the sector itself, especially for services, in this formula will be a composition of the market service and the home service. So what you see here, the marketization force itself will increase the productivity growth of services because you are allocating more labor into the market compared to the home. Okay, so these are the math behind it, but the picture is very simple. The first stage, you decide whether you should produce it in the market or in home. Because sigma is bigger than 1, and because market TFP has a faster growth, you reallocate labor from home to market. So this is this one stage. Then you go to the second stage. Because agriculture and manufacturing has higher TFP growth than services, and these three are poor substitute with epsilon less than 1, you will have to reallocate labor away from agriculture and manufacturing into services. So that will be the flow of labor. And you can aggregate them into one total consumption and then solve the model like a Ramsey growth model to derive the balanced growth. So as I said, we skip the math, I focus on the implication. So what are the implications for the labor market? Now, what we see is home production hour subject to two forces. The first forces is this marketization force. Because market sector is growing faster, so you will outsource your home production. So home hour will fall due to marketization. But home hour will also gain hours due to the structural transformation. So in this diagram, you can see that as resources are reallocating from agriculture, manufacturing into services, part of the service is producing at home. So there is a positive force of labor coming into the home production, okay? And this is why structural transformation is pushing up the home production. Marketization is pushing down the home production. So there's these two forces at work. Now let's turn to the market hours, especially on the aggregate market hour that we were interested in the beginning. So what can we think about? So there's these two forces. There's structural transformation and marketization. Which force is going to be stronger? Well, in the beginning, if you go back to the early, 20th century or the middle of the 19th century, let's say United States, over 50% of the labor force in 1870 is in agriculture. So we have a very big agriculture sector. So that means you will have a lot of labor that is here. Once the structural transformation forces started because of the differences in TFP growth, you see there's a strong force leaving agriculture to come into services. That force is so strong, it will dominate this marketization force because perhaps the gap between the home and market service TFP growth was not that big. So this force will dominate this force. And as a result, we will see a rise in home hour and a fall in the total market hour. And at the same time, in terms of the structure of the economy, you will see a fall in agriculture, rise in manufacturing, and the service share. So that characterized the time dimension for the United States picture from 1870 to about maybe 1950 or 1940. So you will see a decline in market hour, fall in agriculture, rise in services and manufacturing. But then by 1950, the agriculture employment is very small, okay? It's already, almost like 10%, it's very small. So then you go back to this flow diagram, what's happening now? Agriculture is already very small, less than 10%. So there's very weak forces coming out of agriculture. At this point, there will be a much stronger forces between home and market, okay? Because the home service has been growing. So now is the time that is really losing a lot of labor or outsourcing a lot of home hours into the market service sector. So in the second part of the story, what we see is the marketization force now will dominate the structural transformation force. Home hour will start to fall, and you will see the rise in the total market hour. In terms of the structure of the economy, because the agriculture sector is already so small, manufacturing at that time will be about 30 to 40%. That's the time when manufacturing is really starting to shrink. And then we see manufacturing slowly decline from the 40% to the 20% we see now, and the services rise to about 80%. So that gives you the picture of what the model will predict when you look at the interaction of structural transformation and marketization for the hours in this economy. And then when you look at the aggregate balance growth path, as I said, you can convert the model to essentially one sector, solve the Ransing model, and then derive the equilibrium balance growth path. What you will see is the total work is constant, because we still have this balance growth path preferences. But that preferences is defined over 1 minus L, and L is total work, okay? So what is restricting is the total work is constant, but it doesn't imply or require market work is constant. So that is very nice, because then you can capture what we see in the data. Market hours is actually falling. And you have the balance growth path, because the aggregate capital stock and the market output will be growing at the constant rate of the labor augmenting productivity growth in the manufacturing sector. So that will be your underlying aggregate balance growth path. On top of this, there are trends in market hour, which we have already described, such as the falling agriculture, the home-shaped manufacturing, and rising services. And most importantly, we see that the aggregate market hour will first fall, then rise, even though the aggregate total work will be constant around this balance growth path. So what this example shows is it's very important to look at what is total work, okay? The total work composed of two components. So when we have this balance growth, it doesn't necessarily require the market hour to be constant, okay? So that is one of the important insight to see once you take into account what we observe in the data, which is structural transformation and marketization, then you can also explain this nice, this pattern in the data in terms of the aggregate market hour. Well, if you ignore these components, you won't be able to explain them. So that was the benchmark model where total work is constant. Now, there are some discussion, especially about from Agri and Hearst, that shows that leisure in the US has been rising since the 1965 first National Time Use Survey. So they report quite a substantial rise in leisure. So how can we use this model to think about the trends in leisure? In the benchmark model, leisure will be constant because total work is constant. So when we were working on this and we were confronted with this question, so we started to think about why, in the data is that leisure is rising, but in the model, leisure is constant. What are we missing? Then when we look at the way that is set up in the model, we realize leisure in the benchmark model is just this V depending on leisure. So it's the time itself that yield utility, okay? So in the model, in the benchmark model, leisure is just utility of time, your free time. But if you look at modern day leisure, like when you finish this lecture, when you want to enjoy yourself, when you want to relax, you will not be just sitting there, relaxing, enjoying the time per se. Very often, modern day leisure involve combining your time with capital goods, such as you might take out your phone, start the browsing on your phone. You might turn on your computer. You might turn on your TV. You might turn on your video game. all these kind of capital components. Or put it more broadly, you might be enjoying it with some nice furniture around your house. So all this is telling you that it's not time per se that generate utility from leisure. Modern day leisure is no longer just about reading books and seeing your friends. Modern day leisure is about enjoying your time with some of these capital goods. Okay, and so you can modify the model to do that. Once we introduce the full model where you allow the production of leisure goods, so you enjoy the time and also you have to combine your time with some capital good, then you can produce the results that there will be rise in leisure that is to do with the production of leisure good, even though the traditional leisure is still constant. Traditional leisure, I mean you enjoy the time only. So the model can generate an increase in total leisure. And because of this increase in total leisure, quantitatively, the model will be able to predict a bigger fall in the market hour in the beginning and a slower rise in the market hour at the end. So you will get more, instead of very, U like this, you will get more like an L, which is closer to what we see in the data. So more recently, I have some work with Timo Boppa that look at these different trends in leisure across different skill group. As what we see in the data, also documented by Agri and Hurst, is that the rise in leisure is very different across group. We see that low skill worker has a bigger rise in leisure compared to high skill worker. So you can go to that. So because of time, I'm going to just make this one more remark and then skip to the next presentation. So the second remark I want to make about is in terms of the theory. So last week, you learned with Berto about the two sources of structure transformation. So that's how usually people in the literature talk about that. They talk about income effect. So they say that, when income grows, we see shift of the allocation resources towards services because demand for services is more income elastic than demand for goods. And very often they cite the angle curve, meaning when we look at expenditure, when households become richer, we see the expenditure on services increase by more. Okay, so the share of expenditure onto services increase by more. And then there's a second source, which is sometimes called the relative price effect, which is basically saying there's a change in relative price. And because the elasticity substitution is less than 1, so when the price of services go up, you will have to spend more on services. Sometimes this is called the Bomo effect. So in the model I have just presented to you, so usually when people do the income effect, they think about non-homothetic preferences in the sense that the income elasticity for services is bigger than 1. The model we have just studied, preferences is homothetic. But what we have seen is the presence of home production actually allow this kind of homothetic preferences to capture the essence of angle curve. The idea is if home production is a better substitute to services than good, as we've seen there, then when you have marketization, that will be like an increase in the relative demand of services. So even though everything is driven by the relative price due to productivity growth, you can actually induce an income effect. You will see that the expenditure on services will rise by more, simply because home production is a better substitute to the services than good. So there's some recent paper in the AEJ macro trying to capture how important is this role played by the home production in explaining that non-homothetic term for the services and preferences. Okay, so and I will refer you to that. I say before some time, I'll be very brief here. So there's a big literature about comparing hours of work across country. So Rogerson has a very nice paper that highlight about the role of structural transformation, and the low market hour in Europe is mainly due to this small service sector in Europe. And there are, a lot related to that. People then started to asking, but what about Scandinavian country, which has high tax? So here in the Rogerson paper, high tax would discourage marketization, because in order for you to marketize, you're like paying two tax. You go to work, you pay tax, you hire a nanny, you also pay the tax for the nanny. So this tax is really increasing the cost of outsourcing your childcare. So in that sense, there will be less marketization. So the outlier people talking about Scandinavian country, they will say, well, in Scandinavian country, you also have very high tax, but they have very high market hour. So there's a line of research there to look at the subsidy policy of the Scandinavian country. So I don't know if I spend much time. We can come back to that later on in the Q&A session. So the last 25 minutes, I will talk about this second application, which is how structural transformation, home production is linked to the labor market outcome of by gender. Okay, so this is clearly linked to the recent literature on the rise in female employment. So this literature is quite recent because for many developed countries, since around the 1960, 1970, we see female employment rising. So a lot of work where economic research go into try to understand what are the reasons for that rise. Most of these work focus on gender-specific factor, okay? Meaning that it could be a woman acquiring more education, the human capital accumulation. It could be that it's culture change, social norms are changing. There could be medical advancement, okay? There is the pill, the contraceptive pill, and formula milk. All this can contribute to the rise of female, and they focus on this gender-specific factor. Now, the gender-specific factor will basically imply a rise in female intensity across the whole economy, okay, all the industry. And these are mainly supply-side mechanisms. It's like women coming into the labor market. So sometimes they will have a bit of difficulty to jointly account for the rise in female employment and also the rise in female wages. Because intuitively, if you think of the household durable, make women have more time, so they decided to join the labor force, that would be like a supply effect, and that should sort of depress the female wage relative to male. So it will have a difficult time to get a simultaneous rise in the female wages. So in the recent work with Ngai-Petrongolo, what we try to do is to propose a gender-neutral mechanism that focuses on structural transformation and trying to use that to explain why we will see both female employment and female wage increase. Now, this gender-neutral mechanism that the focus on structural transformation is not, it is like a story told by many people, okay? So when you look at the evolution of home production and structural transformation, very naturally, you see that there's a very important angle by gender. In fact, the time use table I showed you before was based on housewife, okay, woman. So if you look at that ILO report, they will tell you that based on the 64 national time use survey, women's home production hour are triple of men. So it's women who are doing the home production mainly. And very often when they ask women, why don't you participate in the labor market? And they will say the main reason is because if I go to work, who is going to take care of the household? Who is going to do the home production? So home production becomes the main self-reported barrier. For men, the reported barrier usually is about their health, other reasons. But for women, the biggest item that women report is home production. So when you think about that, then the development of the market services is very important because it allows women to outsource the home production. So that release women to go to work, that create one job. And they also create a second job because the sector that often produce the substitute for home production are very often female intensive. So if you think about the childcare sector, it will be mainly hiring a woman as well. So this marketization process itself potentially could create two jobs for women. Okay, and that is very important quantitatively. So here is just some data to show you the size of the home production hour by women, which we kind of show you in the beginning when I presented that table. You know, I said it's like 50 hours, which is like a full-time job. Another thing to take away from this, because now we can see more country, and you can see the low and middle income country, the OECD country, the rich one, and the middle income country here. So there seems to be a pattern going on here that along the stage of development, home production hours for women are falling. And that says something about what to expect in terms of women's time allocation. How do they use their time? And this is very important because across the globe, we see that women's education is rising, fertility is falling. So there's a lot of talented, educated women. They, are not having so many children as before, so they have the time. They could potentially participate in the market. So understanding the time allocation between home and market is very important for understanding the allocation of talent. Especially we see education of women has really converged to the men across the globe. Okay, so that is one important motivation why we want to turn to that. And historically, and by many people, previous economists, sociologists, they have emphasized the important link between female market work and the rise in services. And others also have emphasized this link about even within services, when you look at occupation, if you think about some brain-intensive occupation versus brawn-intensive occupation, that can act as some gender bias demand shift. And if services is more brain-intensive than brawn-intensive, if you think about manufacturing is more brawn-intensive, where services is more brain-intensive, then that itself can tell you how services might link to the rise in the female market work. So in this particular paper, what we look at is to say that if, for whatever reason, woman has comparative advantage in services, whether it's due to the brain versus brawn or due to communication skill or face-to-face interaction, there are studies that show, for example, in medical journal, they show that patients tend to trust female doctor because the female doctor communicate better to the patient, okay, for any of these reasons. Suppose women have a comparative advantage in producing services. Then what we find is the expansion of the service sector will create jobs for women, and the marketization of home production will draw women work into the market. And then together, it's like this two job being created story I mentioned earlier on, that will account for the rise in women's market hour, the fall in men's market hour, and the fall in the gender wage gap, because this is like a gender endogenous gender bias demand shift, okay? Even though the shock itself is at the sector level, what it transformed to be, it becomes gender bias because of the comparative. So I'm going to show you just some data for the United States. So here is some data for men and women aged 21 to 65. On this side, you see the weekly hours. Okay, so this is total weekly hour. The whole of the United States, as we've seen earlier on, there's a small rise in the market hour. But this black line, this aggregate market hour, which we focus on in our first application, is very mild because it masks the very different trend across men and women. So over time, market hour for men is still falling from 1970 on, continue falling from their previous century trend. Whereas for women, it's different. Market hour for women has actually been rising during this period, okay? And when you aggregate them, you get a kind of very mild pattern. And then we have the structural transformation picture, which is the service share in the aggregate economy has been rising, and it's also rising for both men and women. So both men and women is working more in services. But looking at the share is hiding something behind. So what we do is, let's look at the hours they allocate to it. So the aggregate man hour was falling, but where did it fall? What this shows is The fall in man hour is mainly due to the fall in the goods sector. So men now work less in the manufacturing sector, for example. And their hours in services actually didn't increase that much. The share increased, but the hours doesn't. So all the fall in the men's market hour is due to the fall in men's hour in the goods sector. The other side of the picture is the rise in female hour almost entirely come from the rise in females' service hour. Okay, so that is something quite important. And here's a picture on the gender wage ratio. You see that in all sector and for the aggregate economy, the share, wage ratio between female wage to male, it increased from 65% to about 75%. And then you look at what about the time use of men and women. So here you see a very interesting pattern. Over time, woman is doing less home production. Okay, so you see the woman's home production time decreased substantially from 1965 onward. And that was matched by an increase in the market hour. The other side of the coin is men's market hour was falling. Luckily, men is actually helping out at home. So overall, when you look at total hour, it didn't change very much, okay? So there's something called the ISO work, meaning if you look at the total work between market and home, there's not much difference across gender. The difference is how they allocate this market work, okay? Over time, women are allocating more and more hours into the market, whereas men is allocating less. So what we are going to do is just to see how this model of structure change and home production can generate this kind of pattern. So it's very similar to previous model in terms of the utility structure. You still have structure transformation across two goods, and the service good is produced in the market and in the home. Here's a production function now. The main difference is we are going to think of female labor input and male labor input with a CES structure, okay? So both sector, or all the production sector, use male and female labor inputs, but some sector use female more intensively than other. So naturally, you will think of the service sector and the home production sector is more female intensive than the goods sector. So these are the assumptions on the comparative advantage of female in producing of service. So how do we get to this gender wage gap, as we mentioned earlier, which is a challenge for the supply side story? Think about a one sector model. In a one sector model, if you have a CES production function with male and female labor, when you equate the relative wage to the marginal rate of technical substitution, this is what you will obtain. The wage will depend on their usefulness in the production function, female versus male, and inverse of the hours they work because of the diminishing marginal productivity. So when you look at this and you think about the data, in the data, we know LF over LM is rising over time. So that means LM over LF will be falling over time. So that rise in females employment should have a downward pressure on WF over WM. So if you only look at the supply side mechanism that induce a rise in LF over LM, you are bound to get a fall in females' wages. So in order for you to get a rise in female wages, you need this to be changing. And sometimes they call this gender bias demand shift. Okay, so very often you have to make some assumption. You can say, oh, because of the fall in discrimination, this term is rising over time. Okay, that could be the story. Now, in the two-sector model, though, this rise will occur naturally. And the reason is when you have a two-sector model, the relative wage has to equalize across sector. And each sector will have this relative usefulness and the intensity. If there is structure transformation, you move from less female intensive sector to more female intensive sector, It's like you're moving labor away from the side G into side S. That endogenously will imply an increase in the aggregate side. And this is what I mean by the structure transformation force, which is similarly gender neutral because it's driven by some sectorial TFP growth. That induce we move from G to S and endogenously imply the aggregate side to go up. So it acts like a gender bias demand shift, but it's driven by a sector bias reallocation. Okay, so this is how a structure transformation model can give you endogenous rise in female to male wage ratio. Okay, now in terms of the hours, you can use the story we learned about previously on the aggregate market hour. So it's the same story here. Structure transformation will decrease market hour for everybody, because remember that flow diagram I was showing you, structure transformation is bringing some hour into home production. Marketization will increase hours, market hour for all. But because woman has this comparative advantage in services, so that means the marketization will bite more for women. So this source of increasing market hour will be much stronger for women than for men. And this is how you can predict a rise in women's market hour relative to men's alpha hour. So overall, what we see is a similarly gender neutral mechanism through sector-specific productivity growth imply a rise in the service sector, okay? And that rise in service sector is both a combination of structural transformation and marketization, and that together will imply an increase in the females' relative employment and relative wage, okay? So the model, we calibrate the model and we show that this is quantitatively important. And we show that this kind of structure transformation force can explain quite a substantial variation in the time allocation. Now, I just wanted to come through the last few slides and then I will stop for the Q&A. So far, even though I have mentioned about this intuitive story about household durable, for example, so far I've been emphasizing the role of marketization, meaning that the only way women can reduce their home production hour is by outsourcing. So there has been a very popular paper called The Engine of Liberalization by Greenwood, Cesari, and Yorkov Group. And they highlight the importance of household durable. So they are saying that if household durable become cheaper, household can now substitute the time with the washing machine, with the oven and vacuum cleaner, all these things. So how does this coming in? Well, of course, this has a role. In fact, there are some cross-country evidence among the OECD country to show the importance of this. But there is one important question that it might not have played such an important role historically, is that there has been this something called Cohen's paradox, which is saying that if there is, so the question is, why did homemakers end up working longer hours in their home in the century after 1870, despite the growing mechanization of household activity? So there, what they discover is, despite there's a diffusion of this kind of household durable, but housewives are spending more time cleaning and cooking. And that is because of, at this time, as proposed by the historian John Montier, is that this is also the time in the 1930s. This is also the time when germ theory advanced, when the nutrition theory is becoming important. So back then in the 19th century, people don't eat hot meal because it's so time consuming to cook a hot meal. But now with the availability of household durable, it's doable. And people realize that it's important for nutrition value. So they do more cooking now. Similarly, they clean more. So what happened is they increased the demand for this kind of home production good. So that is one reason that it could have created more homework. And there was also another story that in fact point to that, because of washing machine, people do not bring their clothes to the laundromat. Instead, they take them home to wash because there's some negative utility associated using public capital. So Joe is one of the co-author here, and then basically they argue that it could be a demarketization happening because of the availability of household durable. So this is still there, it's important, but it's not the only dominant factor. Marketization itself can be quite important. Another thing, the final remark on that is the rise in female employment is actually a rather recent phenomenon for sets of developed countries. If you look at the data in many countries, okay, developing country now, female employment is actually falling. If you look at, for example, India and China, okay, they are growing, they are getting richer, but instead of rising female employment, they actually experience falling female employment. Now, this is not just because it's China or India. If you look at the historical data for many OECD countries, actually, we do see the same pattern. Female employment was declining in the early stage of development stage. Sometimes people call this a U-shaped pattern, meaning during the early development stage, female employment is falling, and later on, the female employment started rising again. So I have some recent work that try to use the framework of structural transformation with home production and show that the importance of agriculture in explaining this kind of U-shaped pattern, okay? And there is also other dimension when you want to think about structural transformation and labor market, which is the dimension of skill. So Joe here is one of the pioneers on this with Paco Pereira. So in their paper, in talking about the rise of the services, they point out a very interesting and important fact, which is that the rise in services are concentrated in high skill services. Okay, so there recently they also talk about how the skill bias structure change contribute to the rise in the skill premium. So I also have some recent work looking at how the rise in the relative price of high skill sector not only contribute to the rise in skill premium, they also contribute to the stagnation in the low skill workers' wage and the wage productivity divergence. Now it's important to understand that rising skill premium and low skill wage stagnation are related, but one does not necessarily imply the other. You can have both low skill wage and high skill wage rising, but just that high skill wage rising faster. The low skill wage stagnation is really about the level of the low skill worker. And this kind of skill dimension, of course, related to some recent work by pioneered by the David Otter in his many paper. In his recent paper, he focused on structural transformation and polarization. There, when they talk about polarization, they say that the wage and employment growth concentrated on the upper and bottom of occupation skill distribution. Now, when you first look at this, you thought, wow, is this contradicting the skill bias one? Now, the answer is no, because when they're talking about occupation skill distribution, that skill distribution is actually measured by the mean wage of the occupation. Now, this is quite different because when we talk about low skill wage stagnation and rising skill premium, we're talking about low skill worker, okay, worker who doesn't have a college degree, for example. But polarization is about the skill of the occupation. And the way they measure it, for example, in Otter and Dawn, they use the mean wages of the occupation in 1980. And that ranked the skill of the occupation. And then look at what happened. Okay, so these two phenomena may be related, but the relationship is quite subtle. So recently, there's a dissertation by Owen Suk-Rin, which showed that within an occupation, there's a lot of skill heterogeneity. And the mapping between worker skill and the occupation has been changing over time. And this explains why we see simultaneously polarization and also the rise in skill premium. So these are something, to the broader literature, okay? And the story of structural transformation are very often also involved in that literature on the occupation. And I think my time is up. I will stop here, and I believe that was my last slide. And yeah, so I'm very happy to have more discussion on the topic.
Thank you, Rachel. Do we have any questions, especially from the front row? You can just unmute and ask. And people can enter them also into the Q&A.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question related to like the implications of including or not including home production into our measure of GDP. So I was just thinking like it seems like it's the case that in less developed countries, the share of home production in aggregate output is greater than in more developed countries, because more developed countries there is more likely to outsource these services to the market. So I was just thinking, if that's the case, is it also the case that we might be overstating cross-country output differences? And do you have a sense of like this may be like something important or just a minor thing?
I do think that is important. In fact, Doug Gollins has a very nice paper that show the importance of thinking about home production when you look at cross-country income differences. Now, it comes in both ways. One is about measurement issue, okay? Of course, the fact that the developing countries spend a lot of time in home production, that tells you that, especially if they spend more than the developed country. I think it was that graph that I was showing later on. I keep flipping the wrong way. So you're right. So just from a measurement point of view, by not including the home production, we sort of exaggerate the differences become for the GDP, because look, the developing countries, they spend much more on home production. If the output of these home production are not included in GDP, then we sort of exaggerate the welfare difference when we only look at the productivity difference or GDP differences. So that is one direct impact through the measurement. And there's also, interesting aspect in terms of, the time allocation. So I think Doug has a very nice paper that basically look at how in agricultural society, because, when they are on the family farm, they could allocate the time, easily between home and market. And so the input they actually put into the market production is not as much when you look at the developed country, when you say, oh, they participate in the market, they do full time. So there are many dimensions. This is going to matter quite a lot. So just from a measurement point of view, this is very important. And there's also some interesting thing I discovered quite recently, which is that you have to be very careful that all the hours in home production, they are not in employment, okay? That we know for sure. So what I said is there. So if it's home production time, it will not be in employment. But the interesting thing I look carefully into these days is that the outputs of home production actually is not all included in GDP, okay? So the 2008 SNA, when they try to do national account, they actually include the home production time for goods into the national account. So home production is for own use, but it could be production of services, like all those examples we talk about, the dominant example, cleaning, laundry, cooking. But then in the early development stage, there are important things such as making your own clothes, fetching water and wood, these. So, and also subsistence farming, growing your own food. These items, these output is actually, for reason I do not quite agree, included in the GDP. Now, in practice, how they measure it is a different matter. Okay, that could be a complete mess. When we were looking at the African data, some make a lot of effort to include the value from water and wood collecting. Some don't know what to do. But in principle, the guideline is if it's own use goods, is included in GDP. But own use service is not included in GDP. So when you look at the data, you really have to be very careful. Exactly in that country, did they really make an effort to do that? But that is making the modeling very challenging, because when we do our model, we think of if the input is not in employment, the output will not be in GDP. But for this small category, which is called the own use goods, their input is not in employment, but their output is in the GDP. Yeah, so that you just have to be very careful when you look at specific. Of course, it's not a problem for a developed country, okay, because we don't do own use goods anymore. These days, all home production are services.
Rachel, there's a question from the Q&A that I'll read to you. It's from Emmanuel Corshi. Is it correct to say that there is a rebirth of the Cohen paradox due to COVID-19? If so, how does that also contradict the fact that in the current pandemic, the majority of frontliners are women, meaning women are both needed at the workplace and also at homes?
Okay, this COVID is one of the main thing making the media also turn their attention to home production. So if you look at what's happening around the world, in December, all the job loss in the United States is on women, actually more than the total job loss. So that means in December, men is gaining job in the United States and woman is losing more than that. That's why the total is really smaller than the loss in women. So when you think about that, what's happening? Now, this is a little bit different than the Cohen paradox, because this is more a demarketization story. So it's like suddenly the market sector was being shut down, school closed. There's no choice. All the children have to come home. So women have to do this home production. Not because, you see, the whole Cohen paradox is a different thing. It's saying that when it's cheaper to do home production, when there's washing machine, when you don't need as much time, why do you spend more time? That was the Cohen paradox, because they increase the total demand. The COVID is a different thing. The COVID is that it's really a reverse of what we have been studying here. There is a demarketization. That's, your service sector is being shut down. So this flow here that I was showing earlier on, this flow, so this thing is just shut down. There's no TFP growth in the market anymore. This is completely shut down. Hours came back. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we see this big loss in women's hour. And it's not just in United States. The ILO report showed that around the globe, major loss in hours of work is on women and young people. So that is the first source. There's a demarketization. It's basically forced back. The second reason is when these sectors shut down, exactly as you point out, these are the sectors that hire mostly women. The childcare sector, the restaurant sector, the hotel sector, they are the sector that create a job for women. So when they shut down, that basically destroyed the job for women. So that second application we were talking about, that's the sector that intensively hire women. So essentially the COVID, marketization is creating two jobs for women. The COVID, which is a demarketization, is destroying two jobs for women. Women who work in hotel lost their job. Women who don't work in hotel, like, for myself, for example, if the school continue to close like that, I need to rethink whether I can still continue my job at LSE, because I have this son constantly at home that I have to cook and look after. Okay, so this is the second channel. So the demarketization, the COVID, is like destroying the two jobs that the marketization are creating. So it's a very, very important thing. And this is very timely. That's why you see over the media, they were saying all the progress we made in the last 20, 30 years on the gender equality in labor market could be destroyed by COVID. And for me, that really bite is this demarketization process. Yeah. Joe, you're muted, yeah.
Any more questions from the front row?
Yes, I have a question. Yeah, okay. Yeah, a really nice presentation. Thanks, Rachel. So my question is that because one of my research, we found So the black female, they're just working in the labor market much more than white female, especially after the childbirth. So I'm just thinking this become a puzzle for me, because when you think about the white female, they have a much higher opportunity cost because they have a much higher wage in the labor market. And also in terms of the family budget, they are much richer for this outsourcing. But then in the end, the result is that they're at home much more than the black female. So is there any idea you think that can resonate?
Yeah, I think when you look at this, I would say it will be a lot due to the income effect of the household. So you might want to look at the sorting channel, okay? Like, what it's exactly like you point out, they have more resources to outsource. But on the other hand, it might be they also have more resources that allow the white female to stay home to spend time on childcare. So the recent work by Ramey and Ramey, so they basically find this rock race that they find that in the US time use, you see it's a big increase in the time spent on childcare because of the difficulty of getting in college. So that could be that there will be a reallocation in the sense that they will now can afford to have the mother specialize in childcare in order to provide for, because childcare is quite a difficult thing to outsource in a way. So this is a very stylized model. Think of all home production as one. But even in the time use table you see earlier on, even when many other home production are outsourced, you will always have this big chunk which is to do with caring. That is quite difficult. So I would say that the income effect will play quite a role on that dimension. And also historically, it's the same thing. It's not just, I guess your data is more recent, right? But if you look at the historical data in the 19th and early 20th century, you see the same thing. The female labor force participation is much higher for the black female than the white female. So I think there is something to do with that. There could also, something about sorting and about the household. I think there also could be something to do with social norm that people have highlighted, during the, early, maybe 1960s, 1750, the perfect housewife among the white community is someone who stay home. So I think social norm differences, the attitude about women working, there it could be different. I think if you look at men, you might find a mirror image. I don't know, but if you look at it, I would suspect when you look at black men versus white men, you might find a reverse pattern there. Yeah. And also the skill dimension might have to do a lot to it too.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Any other questions from the front row?
I have a question. Thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. You mentioned in your slide, page 35, that in the early stage of development, the female employment is falling. And you mentioned this is the same for China. Can you provide more intuitions behind that? Because based on my personal observation, I came from China, but I didn't say that. It's like kind of confused for me. Thank you.
So in terms of data, I only look at the ILO data. So I haven't followed the female employment data in the China per se. So my claim was just, I was looking at the ILO employment data. And what I see is in many low income countries, female employment was falling as they developed. So the number I see for China and India was since 1990. So there's been a fall in female employment in 1990 until now in China and India. Now, the reason why, in China particularly will fall, the story we try to propose here is based on the idea of family farm. So as you know, China, in 1978, we have the household responsibility system, okay? So all the household, they're responsible for a plot of land, okay? So essentially, when you think about employment of women, they might not be getting a salary job, okay? So it's not, the employment is not just a wage job, not that they are hiring in the factory or whatever. They can be hired in the family farm, not getting a wage, but they get the output of the farm. So that is the international definition of employment. It doesn't have to be wage payment, okay? It can be profit or output. So family business is a form of employment. So our ILO will call it contributing family worker, okay? So your husband owns the farm or your husband owns a workshop, you help out, you are employed, okay? Even though you don't get a wage. So that's the same phenomenon in China, because the agriculture employment share in China is still very high. In the 1980s, it's about 70% people are hired in the agriculture. And that is a similar pattern across the world during the early development stage. More than 50% of the labor force are hired in agriculture. And agriculture in early development stage very often consists of family farm, okay? And so what is happening is, as family farm become less important, think about the case of China. A lot of people, they would have will have leave to the city to work, leave the farm, for the older parents there, so they don't work on the farm. And if you think about as the economy develop, what happened is farm become bigger, okay? So look at the biggest difference between farming in the UK versus China, is that in the UK, you will have these very posh people who might have a degree from Oxford, who are farmer, but what they do is they have big farm, lots of machine, other people working for them. It's not like the farming you think of in the family farm in the China setting or in an African country. So as the modernization happened, where family farm is taken over by bigger, more efficient farm, then these women are released from this family farm. So what the immediate response is, they might not immediately join the labor market to go to other sector like manufacturing sector or services. Then first, they have to find a way to cope with the home production. Family farm allow them to cope with home production quite flexibly. They can stay at home, or even family business. So that might be the first reason. So they just stick with a full-time housewife instead of looking for job. Second, it could be that during early development stage, the market sector is not that well developed. So they couldn't just send their kid to a school or to a childcare center. Okay, so they do have to stay behind to look for that. And also, if the market service sector are not well developed, they cannot find a job easily either. Okay, so this could be the reason why during early development stage, as family farm disappear, we see female employment going down. Okay, so this is one story we provide in this paper. There could be other story. Some people have argued about, in the case of United States, for example, they say, oh, there are social norm against women going into dirty factory. Okay, they don't, the family, they don't want the wife to go into dirty factory to work or go outside the home, so the social norm could play an important role too. So as the demand for the family farm shrink, they couldn't go out to other sector of the economy. So these could also be the reason. And also people have been talking about income effect. We kind of related to what I replied to Jiaqi. So they could say that, well, because as family get richer, they are released from that subsistence need for agriculture. Okay? When you are very poor, you really need to work because you need to have some subsistence consumption. But once you come out of that stage, then the income effect kick in. It allow you to work less, okay, and perhaps in enjoying leisure and other things. So these could all be factors how you generate the decline in the employment as economy develop.
Rachel?
Yes.
I wanted to ask one more question that's from the Q&A, if you could just briefly answer though, because we're basically out of time.
Okay.
The question is from Stephen Barlow. Have you seen any particularly interesting or odd trends? Well, first he thanks you, but then he says, have you seen any particularly interesting or odd trends if you look at disaggregating data by class rather than gender?
Class, what class? Sorry.
Like social class. I don't know if that would be by income level or by education level.
Yeah, so I guess my must lie on the skill could be one, dimension. On the education level, there's a skill, and also their occupation. But when they say unusual trend, I am not sure I understand. But there are quite a lot of research looking at by skill group. And there are also, like Jiaqi pointed out, there's also trend by race, okay, different race, how they perform. And by occupation. So that's all I can say.
Okay.
I'm not sure I answered the question very well, but yeah.
Given the time we had, that's probably ideal.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank you, Rachel. As I've mentioned to each class, these professors are doing this out of the kindness of their heart. I think that the turnout we have shows the appreciation for your work, Rachel. So thank you very much. I also wanted to correct that I said next week, but next week is actually the spring break of the course, so you can all have fun vacationing on the beach. But the following week on Thursday, and I guess that's March 11th and 12th, I think, we have Mark Rosenzweig talking about labor market frictions in developing countries, and Richard Rogerson talking about misallocation. So we look forward to seeing all of you in 2 weeks. Thanks again, Rachel.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Rachel.
Doug, I hope
job,
my memory of your paper was vague. I hope it was correctly represented.
I think so too, but it was a long time ago.
Yeah, it is indeed. Right? I was still a graduate student when you wrote that home production paper and GDP accounting.
Yeah, no, thank you though. Thanks for remembering it.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy. Okay, bye.